Welcome to Nature Revisited, the podcast. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me. On today's episode, we are featuring Craig Kauffman and Rights of Nature. Craig Kauffman is an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon. He is also a member of the UN Knowledge Network on Harmony with Nature. In his recent book, The Politics of Rights of Nature, which he co-wrote with Pamela Martin, he goes beyond theory and philosophy to examine the politics behind the creation and implementation of rights of nature, and how those strategies can help build a more sustainable future. Craig joins me today from his home in Oregon to talk about rights of nature. Craig, welcome to Nature Revisited. The subject of our conversation today is one that I have been wanting to feature on the podcast for some time. So thank you for joining me to talk about rights of nature.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking about the topic.
So when did you first become interested in rights of nature?
Well, I first found out about the topic kind of through accident almost. I was living in Ecuador because I was a doctoral student at George Washington University, and I was doing field research for my dissertation where I was studying local integrated watershed management reforms. And a lot of my work was in some indigenous communities where they were given the authority to institutionalize traditional indigenous governance mechanisms. Living there and sort of watching these local governance experiments. At the time, Ecuador became the first country to recognize the rights of nature in its constitution. At first, I just thought that was a really interesting story, but uniquely Ecuadorian. So I didn't think too much about it other than this was one of the reasons why I love Ecuador, is because they have all these interesting, innovative policies. But then, of course, not too long after, Bolivia passed a national law recognizing rights of Mother Earth, rights of nature, through a very similar process. And so I thought, okay, well, this is an interesting story, but not uniquely Ecuadorian, but it's sort of maybe uniquely Andean. Then I learned about the rights of nature law in New Zealand, and I thought, oh my God, what's going on with that? And by this point, I had just graduated with my PhD and got a job at the University of Oregon. And then I also learned that there were these efforts to adopt rights of nature in the United States through local ballot initiatives. And I said, okay, there's something bigger going on. And I just decided that I wanted to understand it. I've spent pretty much the last 15 years studying the various initiatives in their local context and trying to understand what's happening and what's driving them. And then now I run a project called the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor that looks at initiatives around the world that try to advance ecological law. Some of them are framed as rights of nature. Some of them adopt other framings that I think are rooted in the same underlying legal philosophy and are trying to work towards the similar ends. And so that's what I do now.
For those who aren't familiar with rights of nature, how would you define them?
That's a good question. So I first want to say that, as I alluded to just before, I think the rights of nature movement is one strain of a larger set of movements around the world that are responding to common environmental pressures that are creating social problems. Local community activists and policymakers and lawyers and others have come to the conclusion that our existing laws are just simply inadequate for responding to the various environmental crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And they're looking for solutions. They are increasingly advocating and adopting what I call ecological laws. Sometimes they're framed as rights of nature because that is culturally resonant and makes sense. Sometimes the same sort of underlying philosophy and impetus adopts other framings. Like in Europe, it tends to get framed as ecocide. I see them as all part of the same kind of overall movement. And so I'm not one who will say that the rights of nature framing is the one and only framing that has to be used everywhere. It's useful framing in some places, and maybe there's other framings in other cultures that are more useful. But at the same time, I think all of these movements are unified by an underlying theory of how the natural world works, and this idea that we need to have human laws be consistent with the way the natural world actually works. And so I can answer your question by explaining what that means. I think that's maybe the easiest way, in my experience, to help people who are unfamiliar with this concept to understand what we're talking about. The laws that we have here in the United States and that exist around the world that we might think of as Western law were created at a time when we had this conceptual framework of the world where we thought the natural world was best understood as a set of independent sort of resources. So this leads to this idea of nature as stocks of independent resources that can just be removed and utilized without really affecting the overall health of the natural environment. Advancements in science, ecological science, has now helped us understand that this is, frankly, an incorrect understanding of the natural world. Rather, the natural world is better understood as systems in which all of the parts, including humans, but non-human living things, and also what we would consider non-living things, these are all parts of systems. And the nature of systems is that all of the parts are interconnected and interdependent because they're tied together through reciprocal relationships. And so when you affect one part of a system, that effect ripples throughout the system and affects the other parts of the system. Once you understand that, that leads to an understanding that human well-being is dependent on the functioning of the natural systems, what we think of as ecosystems, that produce the conditions necessary to sustain life. Once you start to see the natural world that way, you start to see that our laws need to be written in a way that recognizes that elements of nature are not independent stocks of resources, but they are crucial components to the functioning of ecosystems we need to sustain life. And therefore, the focus of the laws should be on ensuring that ecosystems and planetary systems can continue generating their natural cycles. Doesn't mean we don't use aspects of nature, and it doesn't mean that we don't touch or intervene in nature. It just means that we should have laws that recognize that human well-being, and therefore human interests, are dependent on the ability of natural systems to continue maintaining their natural cycles. So rights are a term that we use legally to indicate what we value. When you take this underlying logic of understanding the natural world as nested systems in which humans are embedded and therefore dependent on, you recognize that things have value, humans as well as non-human things have value for the role that they play in helping to maintain the overall system. It's very different from the notion of rights in sort of traditional human rights literature or thinking. So human rights is often based on this idea that humans have rights and therefore more value than non-human things that make humans unique and different and therefore more deserving of moral consideration and therefore rights. Over time, science has debunked those things. In my opinion, the advantage of the ecological jurisprudence on which rights of nature is based, you can recognize that humans have value because we also play a role in the maintaining of our systems, right? It just means that though humans are not the only ones deserving of moral consideration, and it's not a hierarchical notion of value. Rather, we recognize that we are interdependent with other elements of the natural world. And so all elements of the natural world have value and are therefore deserving of moral consideration and rights. because of the role that we all play in maintaining the functioning of our natural systems. That is the way in which I think nature has rights and how I would define them. They're not going to be rights that look like human rights because they're not humans. They have other rights. We're talking about humans making human laws and human rules to govern human behaviors. Anything we do in that realm as humans, those are human constructs. All laws are human constructs that we create because it's useful for us to improve our behavior. Having said that, there is a difference of opinion in some debates within the community of people who think and work in the area of rights of nature about what is the source of rights of nature. Is the source of rights of nature human law? And are humans the one that grant these rights to nature? A lot of people would find that idea offensive and problematic because it sort of perpetuates this erroneous idea that humans are separate and apart from nature and can sort of control and manipulate nature. And that kind of thinking undermines the goal of the rights of nature legal theory, which is to try to make human laws more consistent with the ways the natural world works. And a key part of that, according to ecological legal theory, is that we have to recognize nature is too complex for us to understand. Therefore, it's foolish and narcissistic, arrogant, and probably self-defeating to try to think that we can manipulate and control nature. That thinking is what has led us to our crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And so we need to get past that. Part of the way you do that is by not thinking about rights of nature as something that humans are granting to nature, but rather that these rights are inherent. The natural world had these rights because the elements of nature were playing their roles in natural ecosystems before humans evolved, and they will continue after humans are gone. And so this is particularly a debate that you hear when you hear sort of indigenous people talking about rights of nature versus maybe Western lawyers talking about rights of nature. For indigenous peoples, to the extent that they're going to engage in rights of nature, they're very concerned with emphasizing that if we're going to use this concept, it's important to understand that it's rooted in a logic of relationships. It's a relational ontology, and that these rights are inherent. We can recognize them, but we are not the ones granting them. They exist whether we want to recognize them or not. Our well-being as humans are dependent on the well-being of the ecosystems that provide the conditions for life.
When did we first start seeing rights of nature appearing in legal systems?
Again, a more complicated question than you would think. The idea has been around for a long time, so I'll just start with that. Even in scholarship among what we might think of as Western lawyers in the US and UK and Australia, the Western world, the idea has been around for many decades. Some indigenous communities will say that this idea of inherent rights for the natural world has been around since time immemorial and is part of their customary law dating back millennia. If you think then about when we start to see it being codified in what we today might recognize as sort of a modern Western-style legal document, you see it then in the early 2000s, some indigenous tribes in the United States began codifying their customary law, which for generations and generations had been passed on through oral traditions. But for a variety of reasons, some of them began codifying them in a way that's legible to sort of Western lawyers. In 2002, for example, the Navajo Nation codified their Navajo Nation Code, and it outlines various rights and laws of the nation. And if there's a section in there where they say we're codifying here our customary law, and that code includes a provision recognizing that, quote, all creation, from Mother Earth and Father Sky to the animals, those who live in water, Those who fly and plant life have their own laws and have rights and freedoms to exist. So this idea of rights of nature is embedded in the Navajo Nation Code. Then you start to see ballot initiatives in the United States that call for recognizing rights of nature. The first one that I've been able to find there was a local ballot initiative in Pennsylvania. So that was passed in 2006 in Tamaqua Borough, Pennsylvania. And then, of course, in Ecuador, adopted in the Constitution in 2008. So to give you a sense of how it's been growing, so like around 2002, when I talked about the Navajo Nation Code, that was only the third legal provision that I've been able to find that explicitly recognized rights of nature. So then over the next decade, by 2010, it grows from 3 to 53. 4 years, it more than doubles from 53 to 127. And then it doubled again in the next 4 years from 127 to 207 by 2018. It's on track to double again.
So it's still a very recent movement.
The movement goes back a long time, for decades. It's just that until the last 20 years, it was all just talk and moral argument. What changed is that in the last 20 years, there's been a global movement, an alliance of global movements around the world that are all working to adopt ecological laws in their own cultural context and legal context. They're responding to common environmental pressures, which are creating problems for communities. Like I said before, many of them are concluding that our existing laws are just simply inadequate. And so we need new laws that are rooted in a fundamentally different conception of humans' relationship with nature. There are active movements in at least 31 countries and growing rapidly.
So how much of the rights of nature has its beginnings with indigenous rights, environmental rights that indigenous groups have been advocating for so long?
So the short answer to that is there are multiple movements that are sort of emerged independently that adopted different conceptions or understandings of rights of nature. Some of them have existed for a long time within indigenous societies, again, because there are many indigenous societies who claim that in their customary thinking, this idea that non-human entities have inherent rights they just sort of take that for granted. It's always been part of their worldview. It's been part of their customary law. Again, their conception of rights in that sense is very different from the logic of the rights that emerged in the U.S. for the rights of nature movement, which is in U.S. law, there's a long, rich history of what lawyers called legal fiction, which is to say treating things that are not people as if they were people because it's useful for us to do so. For example, people know that corporations are considered legal persons, even though they're just, in a literal sense, just collections of property. But it's useful for us to treat them as legal people with rights. So in Western law, the issue is that to be recognized by the legal system, you have to be considered a legal subject. You're either a subject where you're legally recognized or you are an object. So for a long time, some human beings were considered objects. For a long time, slaves were considered objects. Women were considered objects. And so there were movements to recognize slaves and then later women as legal persons, as subjects and not objects. Right? And so some lawyers that helped facilitate the rise of rights of nature movement in the United States, and I would put Christopher Stone in this camp here, basically take a view that we're partners and that the next logical step is to recognize natural entities as legal subjects because we're broadening our understanding of the relevant community once you recognize that humans are part of this, what ecological scientists will call the biotic community. But the reason why that matters is that then the rights of nature in this conception tends to just get constructed in the same way that rights are constructed for corporations or for maritime ships. Some people may not know that maritime ships are considered legal persons. So there's just saying we should also recognize ecosystems like forests or watersheds or lakes or oceans or what have you as legal persons as well. It matters whether you construct rights of nature as sort of in this legal personhood model versus constructing it in the way that indigenous peoples would think of it in terms of inherent rights. For example, in the indigenous conception of inherent rights, there's no assumption that, say, birds or trees or rivers would have the same rights as humans because they're not humans. They're different entities. They have different needs. They play different roles in the system. And so they should have different sort of rights that are unique to them. So you can have different rights, but they can be equal in moral value. In the legal personhood model, you're essentially ascribing kind of human rights to a non-human entity. And so the reason why that matters is if the goal of this whole movement and process is to try to change the legal system to be more consistent with nature, the legal personhood model can be problematic because you're basically anthropomorphizing nature and inserting it into a human legal system and treating it as if it was human. It doesn't change the legal system and therefore doesn't really change our underlying thinking about humans' relationship with nature. Also, it can have negative unintended consequences.
As you have mentioned, Ecuador was the first country to recognize rights of nature in their constitution. Why Ecuador?
Ecuador was a country that for the previous decade had experienced a lot of political instability with presidents leaving. 3 presidents had been overthrown through popular uprisings. They had 10 presidents, I think, something like that in 10 years. And so there was just a lot of disenchantment with existing political parties. A man named Rafael Correa was a populist who came to power promising essentially to disband and disrupt and tear down the pre-existing political system and build a whole new political system. So he campaigned on a promise to rewrite the Constitution, which was popular, and he won, and they held a referendum to rewrite the Constitution, which passed. And in Ecuador, they have a very different political system than we have in the United States. And in Ecuador, indigenous movements are highly organized, and they tend to be able to mobilize political pressure quite effectively. They're large enough to be a crucial member of any winning coalition. Presidential candidates want to get in their corner. So they were a crucial element of Rafael Correa's early coalition when he was first elected. As a result, they got a number of seats in the Constituent Assembly and had a strong presence in the writing of the new Constitution. So indigenous groups wanted, of course, greater indigenous rights, which included authority over their own ancestral territory and other kinds of indigenous rights. And there was a close alliance between indigenous movements and environmental movements, which were also strong in Ecuador, which had an interest in conservation and protecting ecosystems and things like that. The idea of rights of nature had been bubbling up in conversations among environmental and indigenous groups as a strategy for combating oil and mining extractivism in indigenous territory. Environmental movements had a strong interest in getting rights of nature on the agenda in the Constituent Assembly. They had some allies. Crucially, the president of the Constituent Assembly, a man named Alberto Acosta, who was an economist from one of the main universities in Ecuador, was a strong advocate for the rights of nature, in part because of his work with indigenous movements. These groups had enough presence to get it on the agenda. And Alberto Acosta, the president of the Constituent Assembly, played, I think, a crucial role in making sure that it stayed on the agenda and got into the final language. And I think, frankly, Rafael Correa, he was not particularly a big fan. I think he thought the rights of nature was just talk and wouldn't actually be implemented. So didn't fight to have it or force it to be removed.
So in 2014, New Zealand adapted, and you'll have to help me on how I pronounce this.
Yeah, Te Urewera.
How was that act different from other laws, and how different is New Zealand in its approach to rights of nature?
Yeah, it's very, very different, and it has a very different origin story. This law and other laws in New Zealand that recognize rights of nature emerged from the treaty settlement process. So, some crucial background for understanding that when New Zealand was colonized, there was at one point the Treaty of Waitangi, ostensibly set out sovereignty for the Crown government, the British Crown, and what sovereignty would be for the Maori tribes that existed there. Over the years, of course, the British Crown violated the Treaty of Waitangi and encroached and just essentially seized and colonized all of New Zealand territory. For 150 years, various Maori, iwi is the term for roughly translated tribes, lodged complaints of treaty violations. In the 1990s, there was what's known as the Maori Renaissance, which is essentially the civil rights movement for New Zealand. Coming out of that, the New Zealand government decided to set up sort of a whole permanent governance structure for settling outstanding Treaty of Waitangi violations. And for decades, courts have heard these settlement claims, and then the government has tried to negotiate treaty settlements to resolve these outstanding claims of treaty violations. And so when the Tuhoi iwi, they never signed the Treaty of Waitangi 150 years ago. Nevertheless, they decided that it was probably in their interest to go through the treaty settlement process because they were likely to get more of what they wanted that way than boycotting the process. One of the main things the Tuhoi were asking for in that treaty settlement process was that they wanted the authority to restore their kinship relationship with the forest, Te Urewera, which they see as their ancestor. There was a stalemate for a long time in those negotiations because the New Zealand government negotiating team interpreted this as the Tuhoi demanding title, like property ownership over the forest, Te Urewera, which was at that point a national park. Like in the 60s, the government had fully seized all of the territory and made it into one of the country's most beloved national parks. So this would be sort of equivalent to like Yosemite. For many New Zealand politicians, transferring ownership or title was, in the famous words of the Prime Minister, quote, a bridge too far. So there was the stalemate for a long time, and the stalemate was eventually broken because the leader of the Crown negotiating team was a lawyer, was familiar with the writings of Christopher Stone and others that had written about this idea of giving natural ecosystems legal standing. He realized that the Tuhoi weren't actually asking for title or ownership because they don't think in those terms, right? The Tuhoi didn't care whose name was on some piece of paper in a filing cabinet in, Auckland, New Zealand. They didn't think of their relationship to the forest as one of ownership anyway. The chief Crown negotiator proposed that, well, what if we recognize the forest, Te Urewera, as a legal person, and then it could own itself? The Crown government could say they're not giving ownership to the Tuhoi. So it was delisted from the National Parks Registry, right? So its status as a national park was removed, and it has its own status as a legal subject that owns itself, and therefore isn't subject to the Conservation Department's policies for managing national parks. And the Te Urewera Board, which is essentially managed by the Tuhoi, I want to stress that this idea of rights of nature did not emanate from the indigenous perspective, and it was not structured in a way that the indigenous particularly like or find attractive or find sort of fitting with their cultural systems. Nonetheless, the way they put it is it was useful for them because it essentially blocked the pre-existing legal systems that had prohibited them from storing their traditional relationship to the land, and empowers or authorizes the Maori to restore their cultural practices.
What are some of the other more notable cases from around the globe that reflect this changing attitude towards rights of nature?
Yeah, there are several. So, one of the more interesting cases is in Spain, the Mar Menor, the Menor Sea. And this is notable in part because, this is a Western European country emerged from a broad social movement that essentially demanded that the law be passed, and so creating the political base for politicians to do it. And it's been upheld by courts. An enforcement mechanism is being created. Another example that I think is notable that doesn't receive very much attention in the press is Panama also passed their rights of nature law in 2022. And you're now starting to see some things emanate from that. Courts have ordered the closing of mining projects because they violate the rights of nature law. And so that's notable because traditionally we think that these kinds of decisions are driven by economic need. And so if you have an industry that's wealthy enough, they will always win. We're increasingly see around the world that that's not always true. Countries like Panama, El Salvador, Ecuador, and elsewhere, where economically they need money, but at the same time, they're increasingly recognizing that if their goal is to improve human well-being, that intact ecosystems and natural resources are more valuable to them in terms of improving human well-being than destroying them for some dollars that will be gone in a relatively short amount of time. You're starting to see these countries prohibit blatant extractivism that's going to destroy valuable ecosystems. Even though they could get money in the short term, you're starting to get agreement among social movements and politicians that these resources are more valuable intact than they are extracted.
How does the U.S. compare to other countries when it comes to passing rights of nature laws?
One way that the U.S. is different from some of the other cases we've mentioned so far, we've been talking about cases where you have national level rights of nature laws, New Zealand, Ecuador, Panama. In the U.S., we don't have a national level rights of nature law. Probably the reason is obvious to our listeners, right, who are familiar with U.S. politics. Politics in the Congress are so dysfunctional that it's virtually impossible to get any kind of law passed. Certainly something as maybe controversial and new and poorly understood as rights of nature is just not going to happen. So the U.S. is different because you have these local movements that are organizing ballot initiatives, and they tend to be popular and they tend to pass. And they're, it's a broad and in some ways strong movement because you're seeing these ballot initiatives happening all across the country. And so in that sense, it's strong, but it's in another way, it's weak in the United States because these initiatives have yet to be held up by courts when they're challenged by courts. So one of the consequences of choosing to implement rights of nature through local ballot initiatives is that local laws can be preempted by state laws. So what you're seeing now is extractive industries, whether it's timber or oil or natural gas, fracking companies, are preemptively going to state legislatures and trying to get them to pass laws that ban these rights of nature ordinances so that even if advocates are able to get a ballot initiative passed and adopted, they can be sued in court and are typically sued in court. And courts are siding with the extractivist industries to be frank, in our country, communities don't have rights. So our system privileges corporate property rights over pretty much everything else. So if you measure it in terms of the ability to get these laws recognized by courts, it's very weak here in the United States. However, if you measure it in terms of social movements growing and raising awareness of this idea and mobilizing people to take action, it is growing. But for the rights of nature movement to succeed in the United States, because of our federal system, they would have to pressure state legislatures to pass laws that remove this preemption and that recognize rights of nature, ideally in the state constitution. And there are efforts to do that, but as you can imagine, the battle is steep and uphill.
So, as we know, laws not only protect, but they often help to shape the public's perception of an idea. How important is the concept of rights of nature when it comes to a public discussion and change in our cultural perception of nature?
This is what I think is the most important effect of the U.S. rights of nature movement. I think the U.S. rights of nature movement is important not so much for its ability to get new ordinances passed, but rather by changing the discussion in the media and in the popular discourse to try to, again, change this normative perception of what humans' relationship to the rest of the natural world is, to get away from this idea that we should see the natural world just primarily as individual stocks of resources to be extracted, and instead try to get people to understand that the natural world are systems that we live in and that we are dependent on for our well-being. And therefore, we as humans have an interest in behaving in a way that prioritizes the ability of these systems to continue functioning and to continue generating the conditions for life. As I said, in some other countries, that kind of discourse and attempt to change people's perception is happening through discourse that doesn't invoke specifically rights of nature, but engages in these same underlying arguments. You can get to the same place by talking about environmental rights, or like in Europe, as I said, there's a strong discussion around this idea of ecocide. In other places, this idea of ecological civilization is a concept that's emerging in Asia. In other parts of the world, particularly in indigenous societies, there's this idea of protecting sacred natural sites. And I personally think it's important to see all of these efforts as part of one larger project of transforming our legal systems into what might be thought of as ecological law.
So lastly, the idea that nature has rights is becoming more mainstream. Why do you think the rights of nature movement and nature rights is so important to a sustainable future?
I think it's important in society where culturally they indicate what is valuable by giving them rights. Not all societies do that. Some societies emphasize responsibilities rather than rights. So I'll just say that I think, rights of nature is most important and most useful in rights-based societies that are used to indicating what's important, valuable, worthy of moral consideration, and therefore protection by giving them rights. In those kinds of societies, recognizing forests or rivers and so forth as subject or entities that are worthy of rights just helps get people outside of the box of thinking of them as just purely resources to be extracted for consumption, rather recognizing that they're part of living systems that we need for our own well-being. The reason why that's useful, I think, is because once you recognize that, this whole idea of there being a conflict between humans and nature starts to go away. This idea that we have to choose either human interests or nature's interests. But it requires a reframing of our notion of what human interests are. Ultimately, our interests are in having systems that provide what we need for life, like water, healthy soil to grow food, clean air to breathe.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Craig Kauffman. And if you wish to learn more about rights of nature, do read The Politics of Rights of Nature by Craig Kauffman and Pamela Martin. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, do remember, we are nature.